Imagine standing in the heart of a city carved from the very bones of the jungle. The air, thick and heavy with the scent of copal incense and damp earth, hangs like a shroud. Above you, the stone face of a god-king stares into eternity from the summit of a pyramid that claws at the sky, its steps stained with the memory of sacrifice. This is the world of the Maya, a civilization that bloomed in the rainforests of Mesoamerica, a world we think we know through its silent, crumbling ruins. We see the glyphs telling tales of kings and cosmic battles, the astronomical alignments charting the dance of planets with terrifying precision, and the ball courts where games were played for life itself. We've been told a story of a rigid, warlike people, their lives governed by brutal gods and the unyielding cycle of maze. But what if the story we've been told is a lie? What if the stone and bone have secrets they are only now beginning to whisper? Secrets that were deliberately silenced, erased by the very people who claim to be bringing enlightenment. Forget the sanitized black and white version of history you were taught in school, because in the shadows of those great pyramids, in the steam of the sweat baths, and in the intimate spaces of Maya homes, a far more complex and colourful truth about human desire, identity, and love existed. A truth that colonialism and modern prejudice have tried to bury for 500 years. The story begins not with a whisper, but with a scream of outrage. When the first Spanish friars, clutching their crosses like weapons, pushed their way into the Yucatan Peninsula in the 16th century, they found a world that both fascinated and horrified them. They saw a people whose understanding of the cosmos was profoundly different from their own, a world teeming with deities that were fluid, chaotic, and often defied simple categorization. But it wasn't just the gods that shocked them, it was the people. They wrote with trembling hands of practices that they deemed abominable, unspeakable, and a perversion against God and nature. At the heart of their condemnation was the discovery that relationships and identities we would today label as homosexual or queer were not only present, but, in many cases, deeply integrated into the fabric of Maya society. The most infamous of these accounts comes from the man who would become the ultimate destroyer of the Maya world, Bishop Diego de Landa. In his Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, a text that is both our greatest source of knowledge and a testament to its own author's cultural vandalism, Landa describes what he saw with undisguised disgust. He wrote of men who married other men, of public ceremonies that seemed to celebrate these unions, and of a widespread acceptance of diverse sexual practices that flew in the face of everything his rigid European worldview held sacred. He called it the devil's work, a pestilence that had to be purged with fire, and purge it he did. Landa orchestrated one of the most devastating acts of cultural genocide in human history, the Great Auto da Fe at Mani in 1562. Here, he gathered the sacred books of the Maya, thousands of codices containing centuries of knowledge, history, and belief. And he burned them. He burned their stories, their science, their prophecies. And in those flames, he tried to burn their truth about themselves. He believed that by turning their history to ash, he could remake the Maya people in his own image, forcing them into a world defined by a strict gender binary and a singular, approved form of love. The colonial records are filled with this language of horror and condemnation. They speak of sodomites and nefarious sins, painting a picture of a society steeped in moral decay. But is that the real story? Or is it a reflection of the conqueror's own fears and prejudices? For centuries, this colonial narrative was accepted as fact. Historians and archaeologists, often viewing the past through the same narrow lens, either ignored the evidence of same-sex relationships or dismissed it as signs of societal collapse or ritual decadence. They looked at the vibrant, often ambiguous art of the Maya and saw only what they expected to see. They saw kings and queens, warriors and captives, priests and farmers. They failed to see the lovers. They failed to see the individuals who lived and loved outside the rigid boxes the Spanish had built for them. The problem is that a bonfire can destroy books, but it cannot destroy memory, and it cannot change the evidence carved in stone. The truth, like the jungle itself, has a way of growing back. And in recent decades, a new generation of scholars, archaeologists, epigraphers, and art historians, many of them Maya themselves, have begun to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, unclouded by centuries of prejudice. They are challenging the colonial narrative, not with modern theories, but with the Maya's own words and images. They are re-examining the pottery, deciphering the glyphs, and looking again at the mythology, and what they are finding is revolutionary. It is a world where gender was not a simple binary, but a spectrum. A world where deities were born, died, and changed sex. A world where the most powerful creative forces in the universe were often seen as a pair of divine twins, their relationship filled with an intimacy and ambiguity that transcends simple friendship. Consider the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, the central figures of the Popol Vuh, the great Maya creation epic. They are brothers, yes, but their bond is depicted with an intensity that is far deeper than mere kinship. They act as one, think as one, and journey through the underworld together, facing death and resurrection as a unified pair. Some scholars now argue that their relationship can be read as a form of divine queer partnership, a template for earthly relationships that existed outside the male-female procreative norm. They represent a third space, a powerful union of two masculine figures who, together, bring balance to the cosmos. This was not a concept that existed on the fringes of Maya belief. It was at the very heart of their understanding of creation. The Maya worldview was cyclical, not linear. They saw life and death, day and night, masculine and feminine, not as opposites, but as complementary forces in a constant dynamic dance. Duality was essential to balance, and this belief in duality extended to human society. The evidence is not just in their myths, it's in the art they left behind. On ceramic vessels, buried in tombs for 1,000 years, we see scenes of intimacy between individuals of the same sex. We see men in affectionate poses, their bodies intertwined, their gazes locked. We see figures whose gender is deliberately ambiguous, adorned with attributes of both men and women. For years, these images were explained away. Archaeologists would label them as ritual scenes, priests preparing for a ceremony, or simply unidentified figures. They stripped them of their erotic and emotional content because they couldn't conceive of a world where such images would be anything other than taboo. But what if they weren't taboo at all? What if they were celebrations? What if they were simply honest depictions of a kind of love and desire that was as natural to the Maya as the rising of the sun? The language itself offers clues. While many indigenous languages were stamped out, some words survived that hint at a different reality. There are terms for a third gender, for people who embodied both male and female spirits. These were not words of insult. In many cases, they were terms of respect, suggesting that such individuals held a special, liminal place in society, perhaps as shamans, artists, or matchmakers, uniquely positioned to mediate between the spiritual and physical worlds. This is the world that Bishop Lander tried to burn, a world not of sodomites and sin, but of complex human beings whose capacity for love and identity was as vast and varied as the jungle that surrounded them. The shocking truth is not that homosexuality existed in the Maya civilization. The shocking truth is how deliberately and brutally it was erased from our history books. And the story of that erasure and the rediscovery of what was lost is a journey into the heart of a lost world. A journey that challenges everything we thought we knew about the past and about ourselves. We must start by understanding the gods, because for the Maya, the actions of the deities on the cosmic stage provided the script for human life on Earth, and their gods were anything but simple. Our journey into this erased history must begin in the heavens, with the Maya pantheon Onko. This was not a collection of static, marble-carved figures like the Greek or Roman gods, each confined to a singular domain and a fixed identity. The Maya cosmos was a writhing, chaotic, and constantly transforming place, and their gods were mirrors of this divine fluidity. They were shapeshifters, deities who could be male one moment and female the next, who could be born a man, die a hero, and be reborn as a woman. Their very essence was change. To the Spanish, this was chaos, a diabolical inversion of the natural order. But to the Maya, it was the very engine of creation, and at the centre of it all stood one of the most important figures in their entire cosmology, the maize god. In our modern, Western imagination, a god of agriculture, of the harvest, would likely be a powerful, bearded, hyper-masculine figure, a symbol of virility and strength. But the Maya maize god, known as Tonen, was something else entirely. In art, he is consistently depicted as the epitome of her youthful beauty. He is eternally young, with a smooth, hairless face, a gracefully elongated head, and a serene, almost languid posture. His skin is the colour of ripe corn, his features delicate. He is the Maya ideal of aesthetic perfection. But it is an ideal that is profoundly androgynous. He embodies both the masculine principle of the seed, the phallic ear of corn that penetrates the earth, and the feminine principle of sustenance and rebirth. He is the ultimate nurturer, the god whose own body becomes the food that sustains human life. He is constantly sacrificed, dismembered, and then miraculously reborn, a cycle that echoes the planting and harvesting of corn. This divine being, who represents the very foundation of Maya civilization, is not defined by a rigid gender. He is fluid, beautiful, and contains both male and female within his divine form. And if the God who literally gives you your daily bread exists beyond the gender binary, it sends a powerful message that such fluidity is not unnatural, but sacred. That beauty and power are not the exclusive domain of the masculine. This divine gender bending was not an isolated case. It was a pattern woven throughout their mythology. Take, for example, the moon. In many cultures, the moon is a singular female entity, but the Maya moon goddess, often identified as Goddess Wa or Ishel, was a figure of staggering complexity. She was not one woman, but all women. In one moment, she is shown as a young, beautiful maiden, holding a rabbit, a symbol of fertility and abundance, and is associated with love, sensuality, and weaving. In this guise, she could be a patron of lovers, a divine force of attraction and desire. But she was also depicted as a terrifying old crone, with jaguar claws for hands, a skirt of writhing snakes, and a gaping, toothless mouth. This was the moon of eclipses and floods, a goddess of destruction and death. She was both creator and destroyer, the gentle lover and the fearsome hag. She embodied the entire spectrum of female power, and her identity was not fixed. She aged, she changed, she held opposites within her. The Spanish chroniclers themselves, in their attempts to document and condemn Maya life, recorded stories about the moon goddess that hinted at relationships outside the norm. Some sources describe her taking a female lover, a detail that was recorded as yet another example of Maya depravity, but which can now be seen as evidence of a divine precedent for same-sex love among women. The moon goddess, in her infinite complexity, offered a divine mirror for women whose lives and desires did not fit into a simple singular role. She was the patron of those who lived in the spaces between, whose identities were fluid and ever-changing, like the phases of the moon itself. The gods didn't just bend gender. They often existed as a divine pair, a concept of duality that was fundamental to Mesoamerican thought. The ultimate creator deity was often conceived not as a single being, but as a dual-gendered entity, Ometeotl, the god of duality, who was simultaneously male and female. This was the source of all creation, a perfect union of opposites in one divine body. This idea of divine pairs is everywhere. The hero twins of the Popol Vuh, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, are the ultimate example. Their bond is the central axis of the entire creation story. They are not just brothers, they are two halves of a single heroic whole. They move in perfect synchrony, their actions intertwined, their destinies inseparable. Their story is one of unwavering loyalty and a deep, profound intimacy that goes beyond simple family ties. Their partnership, a union of two powerful masculine figures working in cosmic harmony, provided a powerful, divine template for same-sex unions on Earth. It suggested that a partnership between two men was not a sterile dead end, but a creative and powerful force capable of defeating the gods of death and bringing order to the universe. This was the divine blueprint, a cosmic model that celebrated fluidity, duality, and partnerships built on something other than procreation. So what did this mean for the Maya people themselves? It meant that individuals who we might today call gay, lesbian, oskimi, and transgender, two-spirit, were not seen as aberrations. They were not unnatural. How could they be when the gods themselves embodied these very identities? Instead, they could be seen as reflections of the divine. A man who loved other men might see his own desires mirrored in the sacred bond of the hero twins. A woman whose spirit was both masculine and feminine could see herself in the dual-gendered creator god. These individuals were not outcasts. They were imago Dei, made in the image of their gods. They held a special, sacred status because they embodied the complexity and balance of the cosmos itself. They were liminal figures, able to walk between worlds, to bridge the gap between the masculine and the feminine, the physical and the spiritual. This is the understanding that the Spanish friars could not or would not see. They looked upon this world of fluid divinity and saw only sin. They saw a world that needed to be corrected, purified, and remade in the image of their own singular, male, celibate god. They took a world bursting with colour and tried to paint it grey. But the evidence of that vibrant world remains if you know how to look. It's painted on their pottery, carved into their monuments, and hidden within the very structure of their stories. If the divine world of the Maya was so queer, so open to diversity, how did that translate to the streets, homes and temples of cities like Tikal and Palenque? The answer is written on the bodies of the living and in the graves of the dead. The sacred scripts of the cosmos, written in the stars and the lives of the gods, were not meant to remain in the heavens. For the Maya, they were a blueprint for life on Earth. The fluidity of the divine was reflected in the fluidity of the human, and the evidence for this is overwhelming, baked into the ceramics, carved into the jade, and even woven into the very fabric of their social structure. Let's step inside a Maya palace, not as a king or a priest, but as an observer. Imagine the walls covered not with plaster, but with vibrant murals depicting scenes of courtly life. The air is thick with the smoke of incense and the murmur of courtiers. Here, in the heart of power, we find some of the most compelling and once controversial evidence for same-sex intimacy. For decades, archaeologists have uncovered countless ceramic vessels, the fine pottery used by the elite for drinking chocolate and other rituals. Many of these are painted with what are known as palace scenes. These are not grand historical narratives, but intimate, almost voyeuristic glimpses into the private lives of the Maya nobility. And on these vessels we see men together, not in battle, not in ceremony, but in moments of profound and unambiguous affection. We see men reclining on benches, their bodies draped over one another. We see them embracing, their faces close, their gazes intimate. We see one man tenderly touching the face or thigh of another. For a long time, the academic world had a neat, tidy explanation for these scenes. They were ritual preparations. The men were assisting a lord in dressing, or they were engaging in a shamanic trance. The intimate touching was explained away as bloodletting rituals or symbolic gestures. Essentially, they would invent any explanation, no matter how convoluted, to avoid the simplest and most obvious one, that these were depictions of love, desire, and intimacy between men. This academic denial was a form of erasure, a continuation of the colonial project that sought to impose a rigid heterosexual norm on a past that refused to conform. It was a failure of imagination, a refusal to see the Maya as fully complex human beings with the same capacity for diverse affection as we have today. But a closer look, free from these modern biases, reveals the truth. The context of these scenes is often erotic. The figures are frequently semi-nude, adorned with fine jewellery and headdresses, their bodies presented as objects of beauty and desire. Sometimes they are surrounded by symbols of pleasure and intoxication, like vessels for fermented drinks. The scenes are not stiff or formal. They are relaxed, fluid, and deeply personal. One of the most famous examples is the so-called Princeton vase, a masterpiece of late classic Maya pottery. It depicts a series of intimate encounters in a palace setting. In one panel, two young noblemen are shown in a tender embrace. One man sits behind the other, his arm wrapped around his companion's chest, his hand resting gently on his shoulder. Their faces are close, their expressions serene. There is no ritual paraphernalia, no sign of a ceremony. There is only the quiet, profound intimacy between two people. To deny the erotic and romantic content of such a scene is to willfully blind oneself. And this is not an isolated example. Dozens of similar vessels have been found, forming a clear and consistent pattern. They show us that in the enclosed elite world of the Maya court, relationships between men were not hidden in the shadows. They were celebrated, memorialized in high-status art, and placed in the tombs of the powerful to accompany them into the underworld. What about women? The evidence for same-sex relationships between women is harder to find, but this is not because they didn't exist. It's a reflection of the nature of Maya art itself. The vast majority of surviving art was commissioned by and for men. It depicts a male-centric world of politics, warfare and ritual, all seen through the eyes of a male ruling class. Women appear, but often in secondary roles, as wives, mothers of heirs or captives. The intimate, private lives of women were simply not a common subject for the official art that has survived the centuries. But the silence in the art does not mean silence in reality. We have the tantalizing hints from the Colonial chronicles, like the stories of the moon goddess and her female lovers. And we have the logic of the Maya worldview itself. If the cosmos was built on a foundation of duality and fluidity, and if men were free to form intimate bonds with other men, it is almost certain that women were afforded a similar freedom. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply a reminder of whose stories were deemed important enough to be recorded in stone and paint. Beyond the palace walls in the wider society, we find evidence of individuals who lived outside the male-female binary altogether. These were the third gender figures, people who embodied a mix of masculine and feminine characteristics, both in their appearance and in their social roles. We see them in figurines and relief carvings, often depicted with the biological features of one sex but the clothing and adornments of another. For example, we find small ceramic figurines of individuals with male anatomy who are wearing the huipil, the traditional woven blouse of Maya women, or figures with female bodies who are shown carrying weapons and wearing the loincloths of male warriors. These were not mistakes or artistic quirks. They were deliberate representations of a recognized and accepted social category. These individuals were not freaks or outcasts. In many cases, they appear to have been revered. Their liminal status, their ability to bridge the worlds of men and women, gave them a unique spiritual power. They were often the shamans, the healers, the keepers of ritual knowledge. They were the matchmakers who arranged marriages, the weavers of sacred textiles, and the artists who created the very images we are now studying. They were seen as having a double spirit, a profound connection to the dualistic nature of the cosmos itself. The Spanish, of course, were horrified. They saw these third-gender individuals as the ultimate abomination, a blasphemous rejection of God's creation. They persecuted them with particular savagery, seeing them as living proof of the devil's influence in the New World. And so, this entire social category, once a respected and integral part of Maya society, was driven underground, shamed, and systematically erased from the historical record. The Colonial project was not just about conquering land and extracting resources. It was about conquering identity. It was a war against a worldview that was too complex, too fluid, too queer for the rigid, patriarchal, and homophobic framework of 16th century Europe. The tragedy is that this colonial mindset infected the study of the Maya for centuries. Archaeologists and historians, products of their own culture, projected their own assumptions about gender and sexuality onto the past. They looked at a third-gender shaman and saw only a man in a dress. They looked at two loving noblemen and saw only a ritual. They took a world of vibrant, diverse human experience and flattened it into a monochrome caricature. But the art refuses to be silent. The Princeton vase, and dozens like it, are still whispering their truth from behind the glass of museum cases. The ceramic figurines of the weavers and warriors who defied the binary are still challenging our assumptions from the dusty drawers of collection rooms. The legacy of this forgotten world is all around us, waiting to be seen for what it truly is, a testament to a time and a place where love was not a sin and where identity was not a prison. The erasure was a brutal act, but the rediscovery is an act of resistance. But these images on clay, these silent figures locked in an embrace for 1,000 years, are not just pictures. They are ghosts. They are echoes of real bodies, of warm breath and living desires. To truly understand the world they inhabited, we have to strip away our own inherited ideas about the body itself. We have to forget the concept of the body as a vessel of sin, a source of shame that must be disciplined and controlled. That was the world of the Spanish friars. The world of the Maya was radically different. For the Maya, the body was not a cage for the soul. It was a conduit for the sacred. It was a place where the power of the cosmos, the divine energy of creation, could be experienced, channeled, and exchanged. At the heart of this belief was the concept of its. It is a word that is almost impossible to translate directly into English, but it can be understood as a sacred life force, a divine essence, a kind of cosmic juice that animates all living things. Its was in the sap of trees, the nectar of flowers, the blood of kings, and, crucially, in the sexual fluids of the human body. Semen, saliva, even the sweat that poured from bodies in the heat of the jungle were all seen as carriers of this sacred substance. In this worldview, sex was never just sex. It was far more than a simple act of procreation or a release of carnal urges. It was a ritual act of transference, a way of sharing and mingling the sacred life force. It was a form of magic, a way to generate power, to ensure fertility, and to connect with the divine. And if the goal is the exchange of its, then the gender of the participants becomes secondary. A sexual act between two men was not a sterile, pointless act as the Spanish saw it. It was a powerful circuit of masculine energy, a doubling of a particular kind of sacred force. It could be a way for warriors to bond before battle, for a lord to share his spiritual power with a favoured courtier, or for two lovers to create a unique and powerful union of their souls. This understanding transforms how we see everything. It takes the scenes on the palace vases out of the realm of simple homosexuality and places them in a world of profound spiritual significance. Now, imagine a place central to Maya life, a structure found in every major city, the sweat bath or pibnar. To us, it might sound like a simple sauna, a place for hygiene. But for the Maya, it was a profoundly sacred and liminal space. It was a man-made cave, dark, hot, and steamy. A symbolic womb from which one could be reborn. It was a place of purification, healing, and transformation. Inside the intense, dark heat of the sweat bath, social hierarchies could melt away. It was a place where kings and commoners, priests and warriors could sweat together, their bodies cleansed by fire and steam. And it was, almost certainly, a place of intimacy. In the darkness and anonymity of the pibnar, surrounded by the hiss of water on hot rocks and the intoxicating scent of burning herbs, men gathered. The art on the walls of these structures sometimes depicts erotic scenes. It is not difficult to imagine that these spaces, designed for the transformation of the body and spirit, were also locations for sexual encounters that were both deeply personal and ritually charged. The act of sharing it in such a potent, magical environment would have been seen as a powerful act of spiritual bonding and renewal. This was not a sin committed in a dark alley. It was a sacred exchange in the very womb of the earth. The men depicted in the palace scenes were not commoners. They were Ajor, the lords and nobles who ruled Maya society. Their relationships were not just private affairs. They were part of the intricate web of court politics. A powerful lord might take a younger, beautiful nobleman as his companion. This relationship would have been a complex mix of mentorship, political alliance, personal affection, and erotic desire. The younger man would gain status and influence through his connection to the lord, while the lord would cement the loyalty of a key follower. The vases they commissioned, depicting their intimacy, were not hidden away. They were high-status objects, used in public feasts and rituals. They were a declaration. They were a way of saying, this bond is important, this union has power. It was a form of social and political currency, celebrated through art. And this brings us back to the shocking words of the Spanish chroniclers, who wrote of Maya men marrying other men. We will likely never find a Maya marriage certificate for a same-sex couple. That is a modern bureaucratic concept. But what the Spanish were likely observing was a form of public, recognised partnership. A formal union between two men, celebrated with ritual and acknowledged by the community. This would have been an alliance that bound not just two individuals, but their families and lineages. It was a way of structuring society, of creating kinship bonds that were not based solely on blood and procreation. For a society as complex and sophisticated as the Maya, this makes perfect sense. They were pragmatists. An alliance that brought wealth, power, and stability to two families was a good alliance, regardless of the gender of the individuals involved. The emotional and erotic bond between the two men would have been the sacred glue that held the practical, political arrangement together. And what of the third gender individuals, the imago Dei, who walked between worlds? Their bodies were seen as living vessels of duality. They didn't just reflect the cosmos, they helped to maintain its balance. They were the ritual specialists. When a priest needed to channel a female deity, a third gender person might be the one to wear the goddess's costume and speak her words. When a difficult birth was underway, a two-spirit shaman might be called upon, their unique spiritual position seen as essential to navigating the dangerous passage between life and death. They were not violating the natural order. They were the natural order in all its complexity. Their existence was living proof that the world was not a simple binary, but a rich and vibrant spectrum. The colonial conquest, therefore, was not just a military or religious campaign. It was a war on its. It was an assault on a worldview that saw the body as sacred and sexuality as a source of divine power. The Spanish brought with them the concept of sodomy, a sin so vile it was often left unnamed, which reduced a complex spiritually significant act to a crime against nature. The fire of Diego de Landa at Mani was not just burning books. It was an attempt to burn this entire philosophy out of existence, to replace the sacred power of its with the suffocating weight of original sin. They tried to burn the body to save the soul, but for the Maya, the body was a pathway to the soul, and the connections it could form, in all their diversity, were the threads that held the universe together. This, then, was the collision. What happens when a worldview built on the sacred power of the body, on the divine fluidity of its, slams into an ideology of sin and shame? An ideology armed with steel, gunpowder, and the unwavering conviction of its own righteousness. The result is not a debate or a dialogue. It is an act of annihilation. And the architect of this annihilation, the man whose name is forever burned into the memory of the Maya people, was Diego de Landa. To understand the inferno at Mani, you must understand the terror in Landa's heart. He was not a monster in his own eyes. He was a saviour. He looked at the Maya world and saw the face of Satan. He saw the androgynous maize god, not as a symbol of life-giving duality, but as a blasphemous perversion. He saw the intimate scenes on palace pottery, not as expressions of love, but as proof of a society so steeped in depravity that it had to be scoured clean with fire. The book burning of 1562 was more than just the destruction of property. It was a war against memory itself. Imagine you are a Maya scribe, a keeper of the sacred glyphs. You have spent your life learning the complex dance of symbols that record the movements of the stars, the deeds of your ancestors, and the stories of your gods. And now you are forced to watch as your life's work, the collective soul of your people, is piled high in the public square. The air fills with the greasy black smoke of burning deerskin and bark paper, the stench of history turning to ash. This was a psychological masterstroke. Landa was not just destroying their past, he was demonstrating the impotence of their gods. Where are they now, the smoke seemed to ask. Where are the hero twins to save you? Where is the maize god to protect his own stories? But the fire was only the beginning. It was the symbolic act. The real grinding work of erasure happened in the bodies and minds of the living. How do you kill an idea? First, you make it illegal. The Spanish brought with them the full, brutal weight of the European Inquisition. They established courts and implemented laws that made the Maya way of life a crime. Central to this was the criminalization of sodomy, an act that, in the Maya world, could be a sacred exchange of its, a political alliance, or a deep emotional bond, was now redefined as a sin so monstrous it deserved the most horrific of punishments. The colonial records are chillingly clear about what this meant. Men accused of sodomy were publicly humiliated, whipped until the skin was stripped from their backs. They were sentenced to hard labour in the mines, a virtual death sentence. And for those the authorities wanted to make an example of, there was death by fire, burning at the stake, or the uniquely Spanish horror of being torn apart by war dogs in the public square. This was not justice. This was terror, pure and simple. It was a spectacle of violence designed to instill a deep, primal fear in the hearts of the conquered. It was a way of saying, your bodies are not your own. Your desires are not your own. They belong to us now, to our God, and we will punish any deviation with unimaginable pain. The message was brutally effective. public displays of same-sex affection, the kind celebrated on the palace vases, vanished. The partnerships that may have been openly acknowledged became a dangerous secret. The fear of the whip, the dogs, and the fire drove a vibrant part of Maya culture into the darkest of shadows. But physical violence was only one weapon. The more insidious, and perhaps more effective weapon, was shame. The friars were masters of psychological warfare. They understood that you can't police every private moment, but you can conquer a people's minds. They began a relentless campaign to poison the well of Maya identity. They learned the local languages not to understand, but to subvert. They took the sacred and made it profane. They stood in the newly built churches, often constructed from the stones of dismantled pyramids, and preached a new gospel of filth and damnation. They taught the Maya to be ashamed of their own bodies, to see their desires as demonic temptations. The concept of its, that sacred life force, was replaced with the concept of lust, a deadly sin. The fluid, gender-bending deities were replaced by a pantheon of chaste saints and a singular, wrathful male god. The third-gender individuals, once revered as shamans and artists, were now targeted with particular venom. They were pointed to as devils in human form, living proof of the unnatural ways the Spanish had come to correct. They were hounded, persecuted, and forced to conform, to choose a side in a gender binary that had been violently imposed upon them. Imagine the profound psychological damage. Everything that had once connected you to the sacred, everything that made you feel a part of the cosmic order, was now the source of your damnation. Your love was a sin. Your identity was a perversion. Your own body was a battlefield. And your soul was the prize. This war on the mind was amplified by a biological catastrophe. The great plagues of smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the Americas, killing up to 90% of the indigenous population. It was a demographic collapse on a scale humanity had never seen before, and the friars had a ready-made explanation. This was God's punishment. It was a divine judgment on the Maya for their abominable sins, for their sodomy and idolatry. For a people watching their families and communities dissolve around them, their own shamans and healers powerless against these new diseases, this was a terrifyingly persuasive argument. Their world was literally ending. Perhaps the Spanish were right. Perhaps their gods had abandoned them. Perhaps their old ways were indeed a path to destruction. The conquest was complete. It was a conquest not just of territory, but of the soul. The legacy was a culture of silence and shame that would persist for 500 years. The vibrant, queer world of the Maya did not die in the flames at Mani. It was buried alive. It survived in whispers, in coded language, in secret knowledge passed down from one generation to the next, always under the threat of discovery. The story became a ghost, haunting the edges of a history written by the victors, a ghost that is only now, after centuries of silence, beginning to speak its name again. This was the single greatest breakthrough in the history of Maya studies. For the first time, we could hear the Maya speak in their own voices, unfiltered by the biases of their conquerors. And what they had to say changed everything. The glyphs revealed a world of political intrigue, poetic nuance, and social complexity that was far richer than anyone had imagined. They gave names to the artists who painted the vases, they told the stories behind the murals, and they revealed the intricate web of relationships that held the Maya courts together. This linguistic key unlocked a new door. A new generation of scholars, coming of age in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, walked through it. They were different from the generations that had come before. They were influenced by new ways of thinking, by feminism, by post-colonial theory, and by the growing visibility of LGBTQ+ people in their own societies. They came to the ruins and the museums not with a list of answers, but with a new set of questions. What if the Spanish were unreliable narrators? What if our own modern assumptions about gender and sexuality are blinding us to the truth? What if we just looked at the evidence and believed what it was showing us? They looked at the Princeton vase, and instead of seeing ritual preparation, they saw love. They looked at the figurine of a man in a woman's blouse, and instead of seeing an anomaly, they saw a person of a third gender, a respected member of their community. They reread the Popol Vuh, and instead of seeing two brothers, They saw a divine, queer partnership that lay at the very heart of creation. This was not a revision of history. It was an act of restoration. It was an attempt to put back the colour that had been bleached out, to rebuild the world that had been shattered. And crucially, this work was not just happening in the halls of universities in North America and Europe. The most important voices in this restoration were, and are, the Maya people themselves. The knowledge was never completely lost. It went underground. It survived in oral traditions, in the secret meanings of rituals, in the stories told by grandmothers in the quiet of the evening. For 500 years, the memory was kept safe, guarded by a people who refused to let their identity be completely erased. Today, Maya scholars, artists, and activists are leading the charge to reclaim their own past. They are the ones who can see the connections between the ancient art and the living culture. They are the ones who can hear the echoes of the ancient worldview in their own languages. They provide a living link to the world that Lander tried to destroy. We see this living history in neighbouring indigenous cultures that were not so thoroughly shattered. Look to the Zapotec people of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. There you will find the Muxes, a third gender that is deeply integrated into the fabric of their society. Muxes are individuals who are assigned male at birth, but who live and dress in a way that is neither strictly masculine nor feminine. They are not just tolerated, they are celebrated as a vital and often beloved part of the community. The existence of the Muxes doesn't prove that the Maya had the exact same social structure, but it provides a powerful, living testament that the concept of a third gender is not a modern invention or a Western theory. It is a deeply rooted, ancient Mesoamerican tradition. The rediscovery is a battle that is still being fought. There is pushback. There are scholars of the old school who cling to the sterile, sexless interpretations. There are modern religious groups, the ideological descendants of the friars, who are horrified by the suggestion that the revered ancestors could have engaged in such immoral behaviour. They want to keep the ghost in its grave. This is the final, ongoing battle of the conquest, the battle for the narrative itself. Who gets to decide what it meant to be Maya? The Spanish bishop who burned their books, or the silent lovers painted on a vase? The conservative academic in a distant university, or the modern Maya elder who still feels the pulse of that ancient world in their own veins? The act of looking at this evidence, of speaking this truth, is an act of decolonization. It is a refusal to let the conquerors have the final word. It is a testament to the resilience of a people and the stubborn, unkillable power of the truth. You can burn the books, you can tear down the temples, you can terrorize and shame a people for centuries, but you cannot change what was. And what was, in the green heart of the Maya world, was a truth more beautiful, more complex, and infinitely more queer than we were ever allowed to imagine. So what does this mean now? What is the point of unearthing these ghosts and letting them speak? Is this just a fascinating, forgotten chapter of history, a curious footnote to be discussed in academic journals and museum halls? No. The rediscovery of the Maya's queer past is not about the past at all. It is a live grenade thrown into the present. It is a tool, a weapon, and a mirror. And its implications are shaking the foundations of identity for the descendants of this great civilization, and for all of us who have inherited the legacies of colonialism. For a young Maya person today, growing up in a village in the highlands of Guatemala, or the flatlands of the Yucatan, the world can be a profoundly confusing place. They are taught to be proud of their heritage, of the pyramids and the calendar, the great achievements of their ancestors. But they also live in a world saturated with the lingering poison of the conquest. They live in deeply conservative, Catholic or evangelical communities where the sermons preached from the pulpit echo the damnation of Diego de Landa. They are told that to be queer is to be a sinner, to be unnatural, to be a disgrace to their family and their God. It is a message of shame, a message that tells them they are fundamentally broken. Now imagine you are that young person. You feel different. Your desires do not fit the narrow path laid out for you. You feel isolated, perhaps even suicidal, convinced that there is no place for you in your own world. You are told that this identity, this feeling inside you, is a modern sickness, a decadent import from the West, a betrayal of your own culture. You are caught in a crossfire, facing homophobia from the dominant culture on one side and the accusation of being a cultural traitor on the other. This is the brutal reality for countless Indigenous LGBTQ people across the Americas. They face a double erasure. Their queerness is condemned by the present, and they are told it has no place in their past. This is why the rediscovery is so explosive. It is a homecoming. It is the restoration of a birthright. Imagine that same young person walks into a museum or sees an image online of the Princeton vase. For the first time, they see two men, their ancestors from 1,000 years ago, depicted not in battle, but in a moment of tender, undeniable love. In that instant, the entire colonial lie shatters. The shame that has been drilled into them for their entire life is revealed for what it is: a foreign poison, a 500-year-old infection. They are not the aberration. The homophobia is. They are not betraying their ancestors. They are, in fact, the living inheritors of a tradition the colonizers tried to kill. That single image can be a lifeline. It is proof. It is validation. It is a voice from the distant past that says, "You are not alone. You have always been here. You belong." This is not just a symbolic victory. It has the power to save lives. It gives modern Maya LGBTQ+ activists the ultimate tool of empowerment. When they are confronted by religious leaders or conservative elders who condemn them, they can now hold up the mirror of their own history. They can say, "Your homophobia is the legacy of the Spanish. Your shame is the legacy of Lander. My love, my identity, is the legacy of the maize god, of the hero twins, of the lords who loved each other in the palaces of Tikal. Which legacy do you choose to honour?" It fundamentally reframes the entire debate. It allows them to reclaim their identity, not as a break from their culture, but as a return to its deepest, most authentic roots. It is an act of profound decolonization, a spiritual and psychological casting out of the conqueror's ghost. This reclamation is happening right now. A new generation of Maya artists, poets, filmmakers, and scholars are weaving this recovered history into their work. They are creating a new queer Maya consciousness, one that is both ancient and fiercely modern. They are painting murals that place the hero twins alongside modern two-spirit activists. They are writing poems that speak in the language of its and divine fluidity. They are challenging the silence in their own communities, sparking difficult but necessary conversations about the damage that colonial shame has done. But this story is bigger than the Maya. The same pattern of erasure and rediscovery is playing out across the globe. Wherever European colonialism went, it carried the same weapons: the sword, the cross, and the criminalization of diverse forms of love and identity. From the Hijras of India to the two-spirit people of North America, Indigenous cultures with complex and accepting views on gender and sexuality were systematically attacked, their traditions outlawed, their people persecuted. The story of the Maya is a case study in a global cultural genocide, and their story of reclamation is a blueprint for resistance. It shows us that history is not a static, settled thing. It is a battlefield. And the fight to control the narrative of the past is a fight for the soul of the present. It forces all of us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We like to imagine history as a story of progress, a slow, steady march from a dark, brutal past to our own enlightened age. The story of the Maya flips that narrative on its head. In the pre-colonial world, in the heart of the savage jungle, there existed a society that, in many ways, possessed a more sophisticated and tolerant understanding of human identity than the European conquerors who destroyed it, and perhaps even than many of our own societies today. The barbarism, it turns out, was not in the jungle. It arrived on the ships. This knowledge is a challenge. It forces us to be more humble about our own time and place, and more curious and respectful about the worlds we have lost. It reminds us that the fight for queer rights today is not the creation of something new, but the reclamation of something ancient, the simple human truth that love is love, and that our identities are as diverse and sacred as the cosmos itself. So we stand here now, at the end of our journey, back in the shadow of the Great Pyramids. The stones are the same. The sun beats down with the same intensity. The jungle still presses in, a relentless green tide threatening to swallow history whole. But something has changed. The silence is no longer empty. If you listen, truly listen, you can now hear the whispers that the Spanish tried to crush. You can hear the murmur of courtiers in a palace, the hiss of steam in a sacred sweat bath, the quiet laughter between two lovers. We began with a world we thought we knew, a world of stoic kings and bloody sacrifices. And we have discovered a world far more human, far more complex and far more beautiful, a world where the gods themselves were queer, where love was a sacred force, and where identity was not a cage, but a cosmos to be explored. The shocking truth, it turns out, was never that the Maya people loved in diverse ways. Human beings have always loved in diverse ways. That is the most natural thing in the world. The shocking truth is the depth of the lie we were told. The true shock is the scale of the violence, both physical and psychological, that was required to bury that simple human reality. The true abomination was not the love depicted on a clay vase, but the fire that sought to turn an entire people's memory to ash. It is the arrogance of one culture declaring its way of life to be the only one, and using that belief to justify the eradication of another. That is the horror story at the heart of this history, and it is a story that has been repeated over and over across the globe. The legacy of this erasure is not academic. It is a living wound. It is the shame that silences a young queer person in a modern Maya village. It is the violence that targets two-spirit people. It is the ongoing attempt to force the infinite vibrant spectrum of human experience into a narrow, monochrome box. But the other legacy, the one that whispers from the stones, is a legacy of resilience. The truth, like the jungle, has a way of growing back. It pushes through the cracks in the colonial narrative. It winds its way around the crumbling walls of prejudice. It reclaims what was lost. The faces on the palace vases, once dismissed as anonymous figures in a forgotten ritual, now have their story back. They are no longer just artifacts, they are ancestors. They are a testament to a love that survived its own attempted murder. They are a promise from the past to the present that says, we were here, we loved, we mattered, and so do you. The next time you see a picture of a ruined city, half swallowed by vines and trees, remember this. History is not just in the grand monuments that defy the ages. It is also in the silence, in the spaces between the stones, in the stories that were deemed too dangerous to be told. And if we learn to listen to that silence, not with the arrogance of conquerors, but with the empathy of fellow human beings, we may find that the past is not a dead and distant country. We may find that it is alive, and that it has been waiting, patiently, for us to finally come home.